We've got two panelists today. We've got Ruth Callahan and Brianna Kent. They'll be talking through their recommendations in the response to the COVID-19. Ruth Callahan is a consultant as well as our Chief Innovation Officer here at Canny's Purple, former editor of the West Australian, and has reported on the SARS outbreak in early 2000s. She's also a guest lecturer with health promotion and principles of communications in public health crisis. Brianna Kent is our Peoples and Culture Manager here and works across various projects in managing cultural change and leadership response to crisis. Ruth, I think we'll kick it off. So my question for you is that there's been a huge change in the way that businesses are responding to this crisis. What have we seen so far? Can you talk us through some of the key points?
Look, certainly, and I should clarify, I've never been the editor of the West Australian, just the health editor there.
Oh, yes.
But, look, it's been an amazing couple of weeks. It's hard to think that only a couple of weeks ago that we were all utterly fixated on the bushfires over east. We were absolutely driven every night to see what was happening on the ground and the issues around climate change. And it almost meant that the epidemic that was breaking out in China at the time in early January didn't get an awful lot of notice. But what we've got now is a situation where it's spread to countries across the world. Almost every country has a case. The number of cases worldwide is many times that of the SARS outbreak some years ago. And I think the difficulty has been that it has been so sudden and it has left people shocked. We are very lucky here, I think, in Australia that we've had an extra couple of weeks to prepare. And so we've got a couple of weeks where we've been able to watch what's happened, see how other places have responded, effectively see what their tests are on the ground, and we can start to take action. But what really matters to business now is how well they use those couple of weeks as a chance to prepare. Now, that window, I think we can say, is getting very tight.
It is. And what are some of the challenges that you're seeing with businesses so far?
Well, look, I think the big issue isn't necessarily, and it sounds crazy, the virus is terrible. The virus is very bad, but the risk of transmission in Australia is still relatively low. The economic impact, though, of what we'll need to do to contain the virus is going to be enormous. So we're already seeing a large number of businesses that are having to change the way they work and change their supply chains and change in different things. I think we can say, Canny's Purple, this is a rarity now for us to be all in the same room. As of today, we're all working off-site, except
Sure.
where we need it. But we've come in for this particular occasion to do the webinar. What I think the challenge is that businesses need to be looking at this is not the kind of crisis that they would normally experience. So an ordinary crisis tends to be limited, it tends to be constrained. Most mining companies will have a crisis plan that thinks about fire and workplace accident. It'll have something there about a temporary loss of supply chain or a temporary loss of workforce capacity. But what we've got here is something which is very different. It's movable. It's a very rare understanding of the kind of risk. People are surprised. People are shocked. And there's a real sense that it's something that's outside of people's control, which naturally leads to a sense of panic. So where we would normally see in terms of sort of the basics of crisis communications, we would say, make sure you have a response that's timely, make sure you tell the story as accurately as you can, make sure you're empathetic, make sure you're credible. Those are all still absolutely applicable in this particular case, but then there are a number of other situations that you have to manage as well. And so there are some real challenges for people in trying to respond, and businesses are saying that people are confused and they're uncertain, which is true. People are anxious and they're afraid. We're seeing that in the toilet paper wars. People are acting in an irrational way, and there are a lot of them acting irrationally. There is sort of moderate to high levels of distrust of corporate activity anyway. So now we're asking people to listen to what businesses say and health authorities say and governments say at a time when there is perhaps an erosion of trust. You've got many stakeholders who might not necessarily engage with you on a regular basis, and suddenly you have to get a message to every one of them and ask that they all hear and follow that message. You've got a really high potential for outrage, and we're beginning to see that over the weekend with people who are criticising the response to date. You got businesses who know that they're going to get blamed if they act too soon, but at the same time criticise if they don't act fast enough.
Acknowledge that stress each individual is under at the moment, and then we need to support them through that as well. So the media at the moment is having everyone very externally focused on, the wars at Woolies and, what's happening on the ASX, within the day and that type of things. But I think what we really need to focus on as businesses is our employees and what we can control, and that is how we can support them and asking questions around that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point around, people are people. They're employees, but they're also, they have families to look after, they have elderly parents, young kids. There's stress in work, there's stress out of work, and we can't have that bubble over, right? So one thing I wanted to ask you, Ruth, is in terms of those internal kind of capacity building and how we work, for example, working from home, we have to be so responsive to change, and a lot of organisations aren't there and maybe don't have those internal structures in place in order to react quickly.
Look, I think it's a real challenge in terms of some of those internal constraints. So one of the crucial things is that IT systems are big and they're unwieldy and they're hard to change. And so there's something that you may not have in place. You've got a number of people who may be being asked to work in a completely different way that is not the way that they're used to, and that requires internal systems and structures to support that. One thing we keep hearing from people is things like legal restrictions from working from home, so that there may be a range of rules that are in place about having to have an occupational review of your workplace. Well, that's fabulous if you've got months to work your way through your workforce, but not ideal if you suddenly have to send everybody home in the next week. Where there's a lack of nimble capacity for change as well. We obviously work a lot as change management people. We know that change management's hard at the best of times. A large number of change management processes fail. When you try and do change management, when your workforce is overstressed, when they are suddenly having to work separately, so they don't have any peer support themselves, you're trying to get them to move really, really quickly, but at the same time, you're not trying to incite them into panic. And you don't have the capacity to sit them all in a room and train them for 2 weeks. So there's some really big challenges there on that internal level. The other thing we're finding, and we hear this actually quite a lot from businesses, is there's a real confusion over responsibilities and roles right now, because everybody knows they need to do something, but they're not sure, is it their choice to say it? Is it somebody else's? Can a line manager make that call? Do they need to wait for a head office decision? Who's got the mandate? How fast can these approvals be made? And as we were seeing, between Friday and Monday this week, the world has drastically altered. We've cancelled events. We're talking about aged care, home restrictions. There is so little time. You actually need to have a really clarified and expedited line of responsibility. The other thing I would say is that there's going to be a lot of distrust around why businesses are making the choices that they are. And so, again, from your workforce perspective, a lot of those personal goals are going to be inimical to the business's financial goals. And so it's really crucial a business sort of navigates that.
And just touching on the communication part of actually, what tools and systems would you recommend to expedite that, so we don't have that period where we need everyone in a room for 2 hours to learn a new system, but we can just get off the ground and start rolling with it?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, we actually, between organising this webinar and running this webinar, we've had so many queries around our tools. I think we're going to have to roll that into a separate one as well.
Yep.
Because there are a stack of things that you can do right now that are really lo-fi, and I think we're going with lo-fi being the best option right now. Lo-fi ways to try and get your workforce engaged. But if you're not ahead of the curve on this, if you're not thinking, what does the next fortnight look like? What does the next month? Potentially, what does the next 3 months look like for my workforce to be disaggregated? How are we going to get there? So I'll defer that question to perhaps a more detailed discussion.
All right, fair enough.
What I will add, though, is that it's not just the internal problems, because it's externally, you have to look at what's going on at the other parts of your organisation. So Bree mentioned families, that's a huge one. Site visitors, building inspectors, your contractors. Every single person in that chain is an effective vector for this virus. So you're going to have to think about your circles in a way that you haven't done before. other thing is that in an ordinary crisis, and people will be well aware of this, your first step, you control the message. This is not a message you're controlling. You have no chance. The timing's outside your control and the message is outside your control. All you can do is your best effort to get that clearly articulated in your own voice to your own people.
Yep. Well, let's turn the conversation to leadership then. In times like this, leadership is the thing that can make or break good communication practice, but also good continuity. And Bria, I wanted to ask you, what should leadership be doing to kind of prepare themselves or arm themselves against the kind of rise of issues that are coming out of this COVID-19 response?
I think clear, well thought out communication, not adding to the panic that's going on in the media and bits and pieces. So I guess try and keep people as calm as possible and create some certainty for them as well. So that's really important. Listen to what they're saying, and we might not have all the answers at the moment, and that's fine. But I think listening, understanding, and providing that support, whether it be through your EAP or different resources that you could pull on, I think that's really important at the moment. Yeah, and like I said, and like Ruth touched on, there's a worry about the wider community and going on at the moment. And I think, if we're listening and supporting each other in terms of our employee and our employees and our wider community, then I think that's a really good place to start for leaders at the moment.
Yeah, agreed. And touching on that, so there is a lot of confusion and I don't want to say panic, but in some cases there is. Mm-hmm. And Ruth, a question actually from our attendees is what tone should leaders be taking in this conversation? I think it's a really good question, because if you get it wrong, it has potentially damaging effects.
Oh, look, I think it's huge. And the slide we've actually got up on the screen at the moment is a really useful one. This is advice from the Centers for Disease Control. I mean, you can't get much of a clearer set of advice than this, but it really is about understanding that people are scared, and you at the same time need to motivate them while not driving them to inertia. And when the more scared you are, the more likely you are to hit that inertia point. So you've got to start with empathy, and it's no good turning on your empathy in June. You've actually got to make sure that every message from now on includes that expression of empathy, and it recognises that people are really stressed and they're very worried, and they may not be making rational decisions, but there are good reasons why they are as worried as they are. Mm-hmm. So start with that, but the tone then needs to be really honest and credible, and that means, and this is quite a hard one for businesses, accepting that there are things that you don't know and sharing with people those dilemmas. We don't know how long you're going to be out of the office. We don't know how long this is going to persist. We don't know if school's going to change or close, and we don't know what that's going to mean for your ability to work from home. So there's a lot of questions there that an organisation has to begin to acknowledge. Yep.
And another question from Steve Edgar is how regular should we be communicating? Because there's that case where if it's every hour, it's too much, and it does actually evoke a bit of that panic, where if it's not regular enough, it feels like the world's changed, and it literally is changing in hours sometimes.
Oh, look, completely agree. And there's one of the big challenges here, I think, is that there has been a lack of coordination in some of the response that we're seeing at the highest levels. So we had, I think, 2-3 press conferences on Friday, and that doesn't tend to give people a lot of calm. But what you're also seeing is exactly this challenge. People who make a decision and say, well, we don't want to do something that's going to cause panic, then there's a response that comes from the community that says, well, why didn't you make this decision? Why didn't you cancel the Grand Prix? Surely that's the wrong decision. And then you have to backtrack on that call. So where we can talk a little bit about how you plan this. One of those things is you can't keep being dragged to the right decision. You've actually got to get ahead of it and show that you're in charge. You might be criticised for taking action too soon, but that's an awful lot better than being blamed for not acting soon enough.
Okay, well, I think that leads us nicely into what is the plan? What does it look like, and what should it look like in under your advice, Ruth?
Well, look, I think we've got to be really clear about what we're trying to communicate here to people. And we're not health professionals, and we're not doctors. What I'm trying to do though is help businesses position themselves for what's going to be a really difficult couple of months. And there's probably 3 levels of that goal. The first is that you want to reduce the risk of any of your people becoming unwell, because every problem that we can foresee starts with that eventuality. The second is reducing the risk that your business is going to be affected, or if it is going to be affected, the severity of that impact. That's really crucial. And then reducing the risk that your reputation is going to be harmed over time. So I think every business is going to accept that there is a difficult road ahead. What we want is that at the point where you emerge, you come back with strong teams, strong business, and strong strategy, and the ability to pick up where we were. So, once you start to look at that, I think we need to start thinking about what some of those scenarios might actually look like. We're probably at the point in communications with a lot of clients where we're still at the proactive stage. What are we doing to try and get ahead of the issue? We're very, very quickly moving into the protective stage. What are we doing? It's live, it's happening. We have people doing different things. We're having to consider the operational risks. Once we're into what could well be a very dangerous situation, and we only have to look at what's going on overseas, that responsiveness, how do we stay with people? How do we keep them engaged when the worst is happening around them? Hugely important. But then we also have to remember that at the end of this, there's a defensive period. How do we actually justify that everything we're doing right now is the right thing and has been enough?
What about from a communications point of view, having local versus global communications? How local should the MTEL be, given that this is very much a global issue, but every region is struggling in different ways?
Look, I think it's a funny thing about a pandemic, but there's a fantastic, his name's on the board at the moment, a pandemic expert by the name of Peter Sandman, who talks about the fact that pandemics are global, but the response is always local, because there literally is no cavalry coming over the hill. Your answers are going to have to be found at the local level. So that, when Bree's talking about keeping your team strong, that's your response. There isn't another pool of workers that you can swap in and out. This is the people that you're going to have work with you through this crisis.
Well, that leads back to why it's so important that your messaging starts with empathy, because if you break that trust now, it's going to be really hard to get back at the end.
It's crucial. I think if we consider what the planning needs to be looking like, what we've got to do is look at how we structure the comms to achieve the first steps. So if it's about keeping your people well, what are the scenarios that you can think of? And again, the thinking here is don't go with the early scenarios. Don't go with what happens if somebody goes on and gets unwell. Let's think long term. What is the most awful thing that can happen in terms of if you have half your workforce down? What happens if we have a large number in a specific team, a team that's vital to your business? If you lost your finance team to sickness in the next week, what happens? What happens if your IT has to be operated remotely and there's no connectivity? So once you start to think about those sort of longer term scenarios, you can then begin to work backwards and sort of talk about the kinds of responses that you have. On screen at the moment, we've got a very simple set of scenarios. This is how we're structuring it in our thinking. Here's the scenario. What's the likelihood of it occurring? What's the risk to our business of it occurring? And what's the mitigation we can put in place? And then how do we communicate that? It's a really simple structure. And it's one that we're actually really happy to share with clients as well, because we think that the success of everybody in this process is really crucial.
Yep. Another question, and thank you for your questions. Please, if you do have any questions throughout the webinar, do put them in that chat, and we will get to them, if not now, but definitely at the end. Another question from James McVeigh. Are there platforms or channels that are best for communicating externally?
Look, there are, and I think it'll be probably worth us talking about internal comms in a moment, but let's talk through some of the external things. So if you are dealing with a client in an ordinary situation, the most obvious thing is that you meet them face to face, you see them at a networking event, you shake their hand, you might go to their office, they come to your office. We are very often a very much a relationship-driven business community. Even if you're working remotely to them, you might end up having situations where you've got to do physical delivery or physical meeting, things like that. If that nexus is broken, you've got to find another way of keeping those relationships. Video is obviously crucial all of a sudden. It's fine to take the occasional phone call, but the ability to be able to see someone, work with them, have a conversation, see the body language, really, really helpful. Webinars, we're all going through a fairly rapid webinar thing, and I should point out over in the back corner over there, we have Cameron Wong, who is our webinar expert, who's helping us out. That is really, really important. But there are also other ways that you can start to say, well, I need my documents to be in the cloud and shared that way. Join a project management team with your client. We have clients using Monday.com. We've got clients using Airtable. There are lots of different tools that help you carry on the collaboration in an asynchronous way. You don't have to be in the same spot.
You should also note that a lot of them have come out on the front foot and are offering a lot of this for free. While this is all evolving, it's part of that helping out community, helping out individuals, but also they're really valuable tools that we can all take. We can all start using.
And look, if I could say one other thing about your external relationships right now, it's go have a look at your website. Now, Glenn and I, we talk all the time about the quality of websites we see, and a lot of companies put a lot of their effort into their overall brand, but not necessarily into their website. Well, right now, your website is your front door, it's your reception desk, it's your information channel, it's the place that people are going to go to see if you're even open. And if that website's not doing the job for you, you might as well not exist. It's
the place of truth as well. When we talk digital assets, it's the only one that you own and control. So social media can get shut down. There can be issues with it. You've got mistruths. You've got people sharing, adapting, changing messaging. Where your website, you own it. You control it. You can tell it first. You can be the one to tell it. So yeah, we could we could do another webinar on the importance of websites. But in the interest of getting more questions, I had one which has come up for us recently in terms of working from home. So a lot of organisations will do it occasionally when they've got a plumber or something. Some people would work from home. So if there's an issue, it's okay because you can go back into the office tomorrow. You can sort it all out, and it's only sort of a couple hours of lost time. With some organisations looking at a week, a month, 2 months, we don't know yet, of working from home or avoiding offices. What sort of advice do we have for everyone in terms of getting those things organised, and what do you think some of the negatives will be to come out of the working from home?
Sure. Look, I might like to bring in terms of the importance of conversations, and I can talk through some specific tools.
Yep.
Yeah. So the isolation will be really interesting in terms of how do I feel like I'm meaningfully contributing to a greater purpose every day. So there's a huge psychosocial side to that as well. I think I want to make a note that it's really important that we keep our ears open or eyes open to that as well, because collaboration's different. You're not talking to people face to face. Some people may actually live alone and not actually see anyone for a week. You never know. Also, being out of routine. I know we were having a chat earlier, Glenn. You were saying,
yeah.
I'm going to share that you actually get into a routine and taking your dog for a walk at the start and the end of the day. That's a great way for you to switch on and switch off in terms of, when your workday starts and also when it ends. But also giving yourself, some exercise, fresh air, getting out and about as well. So I think those are the things, I guess, from a positive and I guess positive born out of a negative. But yeah, is there anything else you wanted to add, Ruth?
Well, probably in the tools perspective. So where we've rapidly rolled out Microsoft Teams, we had always planned to bring that on board because Skype for Business is planning to be discontinued next year. What we've just done is expedite it and bring it in. And look, I think I can share that some of the lessons we've learned is that we took a different way to approaching this to the way you might often do tools, which is where you start at the executive level and you get them to bring it down and encourage their teams along. What we did in this case is we actually did it at the grassroots, and we gave it to the youngest members of our business in each of the different teams and said, it's your job to get across it and teach it upwards. And that's been fantastic. They've all, it's very intuitive to people anyway, because it's in the Microsoft suite. I understand that their sign-ups in the last week globally have been astronomical, but it's a pretty familiar context. You don't feel like you're out of into yet another platform, and it does tend to integrate quite nicely. The other thing I would say is, though, start looking for ways that you can steal the ideas that are used by agile teams everywhere. So we've introduced a daily stand-up. We already had a group meeting by the entire team, but now we can have single team meetings, which are just 3 questions, but it just means that you check in with every member of your team in the morning, and at the end of the day, you have a retrospective. How did you go? What did you get done? And if you then want to have other conversations as well, we should be encouraging, talk to your colleagues. At this point, you're depending on what your business is feeling and how sensitive they are, they may be comfortable for 2 or 3 people to work in a small area rather than have the entire organisation at risk effectively of one infection. So there are different, depending on your sensitivities, there are some different ways that we can go about it.
I think to add to that, you touched on that a little bit, but the idea that not all communication should be just about work. So there's a real push to be sort of sharing your workspace or even photos of dogs as
show your fluffy stuff.
Yes, exactly. It makes people happy, and it's those conversations that you're walking to get a coffee and it's, hey, how are you going? You don't have those conversations when you're working from home unless you make an effort for them. So that's really important, just to keep that human touch as well.
Yeah. If we look at what's going to keep your business on track, one of those things is going to be the quality of your culture. And if your culture is a bit strained at the best of times, then working off home threatens to sever all those bonds at once. So if it is a little tense, this is now the time to start really trying to reinforce those bonds. And if you've got a good culture normally, don't lose it over the course of the next month or 2. Make sure it is shown that you actually do care about the state of your employees. You
can probably strengthen it. So we're getting a lot of questions about cancelling events and whether we should attend events. I'll point out one. So Nicola is saying that in New Zealand, a lot of the events in Auckland have been cancelled and the rest of the country is still hosting events. What are other firms doing in regards to having events with 20 plus clients? Is there a recommendation from you?
Look, what we're hearing, we've obviously been to events that have been, we're planning to go to events that have been cancelled, but there are some that haven't been cancelled, and what we're doing is keeping in regular touch with the organisers. Just because I think there are a couple of things going on. One, you don't want to sabotage somebody's event. You understand they've put a lot of work into it and effort, but there is going to be a real fear sense, and this is where that reputation challenge comes. If you have chosen not to cancel and someone then becomes sick, there is a really, really big risk to your organisation. So we want to be really conscious of the fact that the advice from authorities is as much as possible to have social distancing. And if you can find a way of having your event perhaps in a larger venue, or perhaps with fewer people, or perhaps have your event staggered over 2 days if it's going to be, instead of having everybody there in one hit. Creative solutions, I think, are going to be the thing that gets us through this. So you don't have to do it in the format that you had before. Even having the event outside in a park where there's a lot more room gives you some opportunity to do something different than sticking everybody in a small room, asking them to stand next to each other in the lift.
And Gillian has written in and said that a large financial services client of theirs has a policy that no face-to-face meetings, which I think is becoming more common, being replaced by virtual meetings. But interestingly, the comment is that it's up to 2 hours maximum. Is that a wellness, do we think? Or I guess they will have their own policy, but what would you read into that?
Look, there's a hugely fast-moving set of advice around this as to when you might become contagious, or how much exposure you can have, or how long does it stay in the air. I understand that there is, again, you don't want to disrupt your business. You don't want to do something that is difficult. But if there's an opportunity to say, for example, well, we will have a face-to-face meeting of up to 2 hours, but we're asking everyone to self-declare their health status before they come. Obviously, if they've recently travelled, that's a threat. If they've got a family member who's recently travelled, having some form of communications to your clients that doesn't sound like you're interrogating them, but that is actually just helping them through it. So again, in our case, we created a really simple form using Smartsheet. That means that we get an email every time somebody fills out the form. There's a QR code at the front door. So it just asks people to self-declare. And some people will then choose not to attend. So you kind of have a bit of subtle positioning. But nobody wants to say to their clients, we're not available. We really want to be available. We just want to make sure that you are safe and that we are safe as well.
Yeah, I think we've spoken about that. There's so many options. There's virtual meetings. Things like a webinar is a great replacement for an event in the case that we can't have those mass gatherings. They come with other benefits as well, like they can be recorded, they can be shared, they can be attended globally as well, and you're sort of increasing your audience. It's something that a lot of organisations are doing regardless of the fact that they can't host events, and it does make a lot of sense. So let's take a second and think about sole traders. So they're being hit hard. If they're being told to work from home, or people have stopped contacting them for various concerns and going out and engaging as they normally would, how does sole traders, how would they stay engaged with customers? And I think we could probably expand that out to how does anyone stay engaged with their customers through this, where there is a lack of face-to-face communication.
I think this is one of those questions, and I'll start with sole traders, but I'll work this out to bigger companies as well. If you have a strong relationship with your customers, whether that is you see them regularly, there's a lot of foot traffic, they're the guys that come and drop into your coffee shop, they're the people that will always return to you for the haircut, you're going to find that some of those bonds are going to potentially be broken unless you can keep the conversation going in other ways. So right now I'd be looking at everybody's social media channels and using that as the most obvious way to get that message out to them. Either I'm still open and this is what I'm doing, or if I'm not still open, here's why we're basically taking a break and we're going to be coming back. But keep that conversation going. Engage in what they're doing for their situations. If you're a sole trader who has business-to-business clients, stay in touch with all of them over this period. They're all probably going to be sitting on the couch with more time to spare at some point. So use that as an opportunity to say, well, what could you do during this downtime that you might be able to get something from? We all pray for that quiet January where we're going to get all the work done for the year that never actually eventuates. This might be your quiet January. But from a larger business perspective, this is where you have to think about how critical is it that you get this message to different people. And this is going to be really challenging for some because, again, if it's an emergency, if there's a fire, you get an SMS on your phone and everybody pays attention to it. Over time, we're going to have a situation where you will get crisis fatigue and people will just begin to turn off. So if you're still needing them to be engaged, you've got to keep those conversations coming in multiple channels in multiple ways.
Yep. Okay, another question from Danielle, and I'm going to throw to Bree to answer the first part and then Ruth the second part. In terms of switching off and coping strategies, so both from a wellness point of view and a wellness point of view, and then also from a media point of view, there's so much information. How do we switch off and work out what to pay attention to?
So I think we really need to be conscious of the content that we're taking in daily, not just now, all the time, and be mindful of it. So, my advice would be make sure that you know how often you are on the news pages or scrolling through or watching, be aware of that exposure and also give yourself a break from it. We've still got to function as normal people in our own lives as well. So I think, be conscious of your exposure and then also, use your timers and bits and pieces. I know on your phones now you can get timers on all of your apps, and that might be a good thing that people might want to
Probably
do.
a good recommendation anyway to have those sort of apps in place, but even more so now, I would have thought.
Look, you're speaking to the worst possible person for this because I am attached to my Twitter feed night and day. And this is obviously a situation which as it evolves is churning out news every moment, and there's always something to be concerned about or react to. What I would say is, particularly for your workforce, and as I harken back to Stephen asked the question, how often do you want to communicate? The sooner you can begin to give some kind of normality, I think the better. So even if it's a matter of here's where we're up to in the morning, but then you're not going to hear again from us about this unless something dramatic changes. But you don't need to be giving them hour by hour bulletins. Switch on to discussion about ordinary work as much as you possibly can. And in terms of once we're all home, potentially with families, making sure that you are conscious of the fact that the youngest members of society have never seen anything like this. I mean, I think even us, we have barely seen anything like this. So the more we can be calm and measure through it. I think the thing is, there's a quote on the screen, once things are there, once we've got people acting, we don't need to keep making them afraid. What we have to do is start to validate their fears and understand where they're coming from and potentially what some of those personal issues and tragedies might look like.
Okay, well, let's talk about misinformation. It was a question that came through from Warwick around, can you make a comment on how that's impacting on the conversation and maybe pass a few comments? I know that could again be another webinar, so I'm going to cut you off, but if you could just touch on how to deal with that and how to separate fact from fiction.
Yeah, so one of the things we've actually done as a business is released to clients a media intelligence package, which is basically separating the news and the noise. And that, to me, is a really sensible thing, that you want to know the updates. There's no chance that you want to skip anything important, but you absolutely don't need to see, your crazy cousin Joe's opinions about contrails on Facebook. You actually want to just focus on the stuff that's going to be business critical and people critical. So at this point, I think it's a really good way of narrowing what you're looking for. Once we start to move into the process though, when we're having a bit more economic change, I think businesses are going to have to start being really savvy about where they get their information about making the next choice. There will be that sense that businesses don't want to rush into anything. Who are the advisors you're talking to? Who are the trusted advisors that you can turn to and ask questions of? Get multiple opinions if you need to, but don't just respond to, here's what I read on Twitter.
Yep. Question from Steve. How do you balance the desire to focus on keeping people healthy in communication with the inevitable question around pay and avoiding the management of the issue before an IR issue?
Look, I'll start with that one, then I'll flick over to Bree for some of the issues around this. This is going to be, I think, a huge challenge. Obviously, nobody wants to be in a situation where they make people redundant. They don't want to be in a situation where they're going to have to cut staff hours. But I don't think we can look out the door and not understand the sheer enormity of what we potentially face. This is one of those things where you want to make a really clear policy and you want to be able to stick by it. But when you don't know what the potential impact is going to be, it's very hard to do. So some of the things I think is, if you are in a situation where you can switch working formats without changing somebody's employment conditions, fantastic. If they can work from home, get them working from home. If you can't, if they don't have work to do there, that's where you really have to have some conversations. And you really need by now to have some thinking internally about, what do you do if that person isn't sick themselves, but their partner's sick? Or if they're not, if they've returned from overseas and then going to be 2 weeks at home and you can't get them working, how is that going to be covered? There are lots of different ways that you can approach it, but it's a challenge.
Yeah, I think we need to start brainstorming and thinking, like you mentioned at the start there, Ruth. It's really important that we're proactive and ahead of the curve with this type of stuff. So start thinking about you and your business and what that would look like if these examples were to happen. And then I think I think that's the main stuff that we just need to be looking at, is pre-planning, staying proactive and ahead of the curve. And then, there's a lot that we don't know at this point in time, so we just have to wait and see how it plays out. Also keep an eye on what other businesses are suggesting and doing. Reach out to your networks and have conversations and start to brainstorm. I think it's really important at the moment that we reach out to everyone in the community and that we band together and help each other at a time like this. I think we'll all really benefit from something like that as well.
And this is where that local solution is going to be really important. In the same way that your local Facebook group is beginning to start to say, well, here's how we'll share around those excess toilet rolls. We can start to think as a business community, what are the ways that we can make sure that if there's work to be shared, it's shared at a local level. We can keep the businesses in our communities standing, because that does become really crucial.
Yep. We've got a few more questions, but if there are any last questions, please submit them now so we can be sure to cover them off. One that I've got here is, how would you recommend business development and salespeople communicate with their clients? And in considering, how do we balance empathy and maintaining a focus on preserving our business integrity, growing revenue, all those good things that make us turn?
Yeah, look, it's tricky. So with sales, I think you're going to have to start thinking about, well, what does this look like on the recovery end, as well as what do my clients really need right now? So chances are they're going to be changing their focus, particularly from a professional services perspective. You've got to understand that the products and services you sold them a month ago may not be the things that they want now. Can you provide the things that they require? We've seen that really well with some of the lawyers who are making some really good strides in terms of defining what the director's responsibilities are and what kinds of activities they should be doing and for continuous disclosure. And we'll be probably revisiting that in our business continuity webinar later this week. But Similarly, if you're in a situation where you're trying to sell somebody a round circle and they no longer want a round circle, you're in a demand crisis. You actually have to either figure out a way to create that demand, which will be very tough, or you go and find where the demand is. The second question, I think, in terms about empathy and how these things are done, just be human. I mean, let's just start with the fact that this is a pandemic that's affecting every human on the planet. And if you can demonstrate that you're not a faceless corporate, but you're actually somebody who's able to talk to clients and customers and potential customers on that human level, I think you're going to be in a better spot. It's not going to change the fact that this will be a difficult couple of months, but it will make you in a much stronger position when we recover.
And that idea of being human and being real and empathetic has come up a few times. So I think that's, for me, certainly a big takeaway from this discussion. Were there any final thoughts before we sort of close it out from either of you?
Look, I'll only add that we are watching this obviously as closely as anyone else, and we do think that there are some areas that we'd like to work with clients a bit more. We'll share the details of both the technology skill up webinar, and I think what we can offer you there is probably 5 or 6 really easy ways to get your teams working more effectively, all at low investment, all at fairly simple approach. But we think it's important knowledge that we need to be sharing, because if we don't do this in an open source way, there'll be lots of businesses that really struggle. The second thing we will do is have a continuity webinar, and in that case, can I announce the fact that we will have it led by Jen Morris, who is very well known around town, a superb consultant and really expert in this space. So we'll be able to announce the times for both of those.
Awesome, thank you. Anything for yourself, Ray?
No, that's what.
No, it's covered it all.
Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Well, I've had some questions about the slides. We certainly will be sending those around. We've also recorded the session, so if there's anyone in your organisation that has missed it or you want to watch it again, you can do so. We did also mention that we've got the Media Intelligence daily report, so if you are finding it difficult to work out who to listen to and what news to listen to, then I would suggest signing up to that, and that's a daily digest. So that will all follow from this session. But from all of us, I'd like to thank you for joining us. If I didn't get to your questions, I do apologise. Please send them through, and we'll be in contact with you. Thank you very much.